Hello everyone, my name is Anna. I welcome you all back to another English video where we are going to continue with our studies of the Brit Hadashah. In today's video, we are going to be analyzing the last chapter of the Good News of Mark, and as well I'm going to be giving a very short conclusion of what we read through or what we have learned throughout this whole Good News of Mark. But before we begin with today's chapter, first we're going to remember what we studied in the previous video, which was titled Wounded and Humiliated to Give Us Great Redemption. And in this video was based in chapter 15 of Mark. In this chapter 15, we read that Yeshua undergoes his trial before Pilate, who questions him about his kingship. And we can read that throughout this whole trial that Yeshua went through, Pilate mentions or tells him about all the accusations that the chief priests were using to blame Yeshua, and therefore have a very good reason to give him death. But we can read that Yeshua, despite hearing all of these false accusations, he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to free himself from death because he understood that he had to die so that he can fulfill the prophecies, and so that he can also give himself as that perfect offering that was going to forgive the sins of every soul that returned to the Father through him, and therefore with sincerity would start living a life in obedience and in consecration. So since Yeshua, we were reading how Yeshua, understanding all of this, he didn't try to free himself from death. Rather, what he did was he just let Pilate come to his own conclusions, which we read that Pilate ended up choosing to offer the crowd for them to decide who was going to be freed and who was going to be sentenced to death. And this decision that Pilate offered the crowd to do was between Yeshua and Barabbas. Barabbas, we read that he was known as a dangerous person of that time. But we can read, or in this chapter of 15, we read that the crowd, influenced by the chief priests, they decided to give freedom to Barabbas, the prisoner, and therefore give death to Yeshua the Messiah. And in this action that the crowd or the multitude took, we were able to see and compare it to the condition of the human being. Why? Well, because the human being lets themselves be carried away by their emotions, let themselves be misled by the opinions or the teachings of other people, and therefore they end up taking decisions, how we read that it was the case of the crowd. They ended up taking decisions that are not correct, and therefore that decision, they have to suffer its consequence. So in this section of verses where it narrates about the crowd choosing to give freedom to a person which represented danger to the crowd, which represented danger to that nation, they decided to give freedom to that person and give death to Yeshua, we have read, and sadly we can see that they couldn't recognize him as a Messiah because he didn't come how they, or in this case, how the religious people had been teaching of how the coming of the Messiah had to occur. And since in this case Yeshua's coming didn't fulfill all the requirements of the religious people, therefore they couldn't accept Yeshua's coming as a Messiah. They rejected it, and therefore we can see that they ended up taking a decision that was obviously not correct. And we read in this chapter 15 that due to this election done by the crowd, Yeshua is first beaten, then he is mocked, and lastly he is crowned with thorns by the Roman soldiers, who then took him to Golgotha, where he was hanged on a timber between two robbers. In this section of verses, we saw how Yeshua is treated like if he was a robber. After this whole process that Yeshua went through, we read that Yeshua cries out his last words saying, my Elohim, why have you forsaken him? And Yeshua mentions or repeats this phrase that is found within a phrase that one of the prophets had said. But we can read that in this moment where Yeshua cries these words, his last words out, he right away dies. And we read that the moment that Yeshua dies, darkness falls upon the land or the earth. And not only that, but also a big earthquake occurs, where in all of this physically, all of these signs that occurred, or these events that occurred the moment Yeshua dies, it shows the authority that Yeshua has as the Messiah, and how it verifies how Yeshua was the Messiah that they were waiting for, which they weren't able to see, they weren't able to recognize and accept, and rather they rejected his coming, they rejected his teachings, they rejected the salvation that Yeshua was bringing. And therefore, we now that we have been reading not only the teachings of Yeshua, but also his parables, the promises, celestial promises that he brings towards the believer, the message of redemption that he taught, and that later on his disciples, the apostles, they taught this message towards or to all the nations, and therefore, or thanks to that, it is why we now have the opportunity to be able to read these teachings of Yeshua. It shows us that Yeshua is the Messiah. Lastly, in this chapter 15, we read about Joseph, who was part of the Sanhedrin. And in this case, we read in these last verses a difference that marks between the other members of the Sanhedrin and him. The verses narrated how he, besides him being part of the Sanhedrin, which was a group of religious people, and which in this case led Yeshua to his death, we can read that this person, Joseph, he had that faith in the promises of the celestial promises that Yeshua was bringing. He had that faith, and he believed that Yeshua was the Messiah. For that reason, it is why Joseph, this person, he asks Pilate for Yeshua's body, so that Joseph, having Yeshua's body, can give Yeshua the decent burial that he deserved as the Messiah. And in this, we read how, or it taught us how, it teaches us how Joseph, being part of a group that not only rejected Yeshua, but also made false accusations about him, and also took or sentenced Yeshua to his death, he didn't act like them, like the rest of the people, like the rest of the members of the Sanhedrin. Rather, what he did was he not only recognized Yeshua as a Messiah, but he also believed in the promises and teachings that he brought towards humanity. And not only that, but also acted in faith, which he did that by taking Yeshua's body and preparing his body for his burial, giving him a decent burial, the burial that he deserved as the Messiah. And this is basically what we saw in this chapter 15 of Mark. And for today's video, we are going to be analyzing the last chapter of Mark, chapter 16. And how I mentioned, I'm also going to be giving a very short conclusion of what we read throughout this whole good news of Mark. The title for today's video is The Prophecy Fulfilled to Give Redemption to the World. In this chapter 16, we are going to be reading the details that it gives about Yeshua's resurrection and subsequent appearances that he does towards two women and towards all his disciples. And in all of this, we're going to be seeing how Yeshua gives to tells his disciples about the Great Commission that they were going to be that they were going to have the responsibility of doing, which was to spread the gospel, or to spread the message of the good news to all the nations. And Yeshua, we're going to be reading how Yeshua gives his disciples a promise, which was towards the coming of the Ruach, which was going to guide them and was going to accompany them in the rest of their pilgrimage. With this introduction, let's begin reading verses 1 to 8 of chapter 16, which says, "When the Shabbat was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone from us from the entrance of the tomb?' And looking up, they saw that the stone had already been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. He said to them, 'Do not be alarmed. You seek Yeshua of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he has told you.' And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." In this first section of verses, we can read about the resurrection of Yeshua, another prophecy that was fulfilled by the Messiah. This book of Mark gives us a bit more detail about the specific day that Yeshua was resurrected, something that the other Gospels, such as Matthew, Luke, and John, it doesn't provide. For example, in this Gospel of Mark, which not only is it the oldest, but it also narrates saying, "After the Shabbat, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices to prepare Yeshua's body." Here it mentions that all of this occurred once Shabbat, or once the day of rest, had finished. And it also mentions saying very early, or another detail that it mentions, which the other Gospels don't mention, it is when it says, "Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb." Here, the detail that it gives, and which is not provided in the rest of the Gospel, it is where it says, "very early on the first day of the week." So, in other words, after Shabbat was over, the next day, when the sun had risen, they went to Yeshua's tomb. So, with these details that we read within these verses, it isn't something that is provided within the other Gospels. So it is also very important, or the reason why I am mentioning these details is because, unfortunately, some religious people use this phrase to teach that this day of resurrection occurred on a specific Sunday. And in this way, it is how they have imposed Sunday as the day of rest. Not only do they fall into the error of changing the day of rest that has been, or that was established in the beginning of the creation by the Creator himself, where we can read this establishment that the Eternal did within Genesis, the first chapter, where it says that the day of rest is on the seventh day of the week, which is, or also called as Shabbat, and Shabbat occurs from Friday afternoon to Saturday afternoon. So therefore, understanding this, it is easy for us to understand that Sunday cannot be the day of rest. Rather, the day of rest is from Friday afternoon from Friday evening to Saturday evening, where the first day of the week, how it narrates in these verses, is from Saturday evening till Sunday evening. So understanding all of this, it makes it easy to understand also that Yeshua could not resurrect only on Sundays how many religions teach. And I say this because I think most of us know that within some certain religions that believe in the Messiah and his resurrection and his coming, they teach that that Yeshua, or Jesus as they call him, he resurrects on Sunday morning on or using a specific date every year. But in this case, not only understanding how the days are counted within the Bible, which is from one evening to another evening, but also understanding that the day of rest is from Friday evening till Saturday afternoon, and also understanding that all of this event that happened, starting with with the whole process of Yeshua's death to his burial, till his resurrection, all of this occurred during the holy appointments of that time, which were Pesach, Matzot, and Bikurim, which all of these holy appointments do not have specific days year after year where they are celebrated. This is because the days vary each year. Another fact that we can read in these verses is that when these two women, Mary Magdalene along with Mary the mother of James and with Salome, go to Yeshua's tomb so that they can prepare his body, they take aromatic herbs with them. And this is because naturally the body, once it is dead, it starts to decompose and it starts to smell bad. However, it is here when we can read that the fulfillment of the prophecy comes in Yeshua, is fulfilled in Yeshua, who despite him dying and there being a lot of witnesses who saw Yeshua's death, he comes back to life, giving that redemption to the world. And in this case, something special is that these two women, along with Salome, saw this prophecy being fulfilled about the resurrection of Yeshua. And we can even read how, although they didn't see Yeshua physically, they did see an angel or a messenger of the Eternal, which gave them this message of these good news of Yeshua's resurrection. We can read that these women, they were alarmed, they were surprised. It was not something that was common to see. It was not something that they were expecting. They were expecting to see a body, Yeshua's dead body, but rather they didn't see Yeshua's body, and they saw this messenger who it narrates that he was wearing a white robe, and therefore they were surprised that all of this was happening. They did not know how to react to this situation. But we can read how they witnessed, or they were the first ones to receive this message of the fulfilling of the prophecy that was fulfilled by Yeshua. And in this event of resurrection that occurs, and that these two Marys witnessed, or they were the first ones to receive this message, we can see how this action of the resurrection goes against the human nature itself, and which is also impossible for human beings to experience. This is regarding to the resurrection. Why? Well, because it is not normal for a person to go through all that suffering, go through all that suffering and die, and then come back to life like if nothing happened. And this good news was not only given to these two Marys and to Salome, but it was also given, we're going to be reading in the next verses, how it is also given to two of his disciples who were walking along the road. That is how these verses narrated as. And as well, later on, in the next verses, we're also going to be reading how the rest of his disciples also receive this message of the fulfillment of this prophecy of Yeshua's resurrection. This message of the good news was a form of hope that was given to these women and disciples. And now us who read these verses, we also receive the hope of the soul's redemption, just as it was in the case of these disciples and these women. Continuing with verses 9 to 13, it says, Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they wouldn't believe it. After these things, he appeared in another form to 2 of them, as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest of the disciples, but they did not believe them. In these verses, we read about the appearance that Yeshua continues to do towards his disciples. And all of this happened because it was something very important at that time that had to be known. And that through these appearances to different people, the good news of Yeshua's resurrection was going to be known, not only in that time, but also we have the opportunity to read about this message of the good news of Yeshua's resurrection. However, we can read in these verses that the disciples, when they hear that Yeshua had resurrected, they didn't believe. And even in other gospels, we can read that when they saw Yeshua in person, they couldn't believe that Yeshua was alive. This was because they had witnessed everything that Yeshua had to go through so that he can be sentenced to death. So seeing all of that procedure that Yeshua went through, it was hard for them to believe that Yeshua was able to resurrect after everything that he had went through physically. And the reason why the disciples acted like this was also because it was disbelief, it was lack of faith and hardness of their hearts. However, when they see the evidence that Yeshua shows them, confirming that he is a Messiah and that he did resurrect, this is something that we can read in the other gospels. Not only do they not only see this confirmation, but they also receive an exhortation from the Messiah for the lack of faith that they had and the hardness of heart that they also had. And reading this attitude of the disciples, it demonstrates a lack of faith and disbelief that they had, and which also gives us an exhortation to remove the disbelief that may exist within our lives or in our lives. And even more, if we call ourselves believers in the faith that Yeshua comes to teach us, it is important for us to remove that lack of faith, to remove the disbelief, to remove that hardness of heart, because removing all of this will help us to believe in the truth which comes from Yeshua and his teachings. In other words, we cannot say that we believe if we do not have faith. Believing goes hand in hand with doing, with actions, with fruits that we give, with the good testimony that we give. In other words, our faith is demonstrated through our works, through our testimony, and not through only words that we can say. We can take the perfect example of the disciples, who in this case we can read that seeing all of this resurrection of Yeshua, they're in disbelief, which causes them to lack in faith. However, after receiving this exhortation from Yeshua and after understanding everything that was happening, all the prophecies that were being fulfilled of the Messiah, they correct their path, they correct their decision, and they start living, or they start leading a life of faith and good testimony, becoming those good examples that we must take as believers. From verses 14 to 18, we read about the Great Commission that was given to the 11 disciples, who were chosen to carry out this responsibility that we read in verse 15 and 16, where it says, Yeshua tells them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." And not only does Yeshua give them this ordinance of the Great Commission to his disciples, but also Yeshua accompanies it with giving them signs that would confirm those who truly believe, and which we can see them being fulfilled in the disciples that were, or that had been sent by Yeshua himself. And we can also see this fulfillment within the life of Shaul of Tarsus, or also known as Paul. These signs were regarding to what we can read in verses 17 and 18, where Yeshua says, "And these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover." All of these signs, all of this responsibility of teaching, or of teaching the message of the good news towards the nations, or towards the nations, all of this was fulfilled not only by the disciples but also by the apostles. In verses 19 to 20, it narrates the ascension of Yeshua towards the heavens. We read that once Yeshua fulfilled his purpose in this earth, he ascended to the right hand of the Father and left the Great Commission in charge of his 12 or his 11 disciples, who also had to fulfill their calling, which was to bring the message of redemption to the people of the nations. And in these two verses, we can read that in the disciples and apostles fulfilling this great commission that Yeshua leaves them in charge with, they become those good testimonies for us today. Today, as believers, it shows us the way that we must fulfill our calling, which obviously we know it's not the same as it was in the case of the disciples and the apostles. In other words, we do not have the obligation to go from nation to nation to teach the good news, but our calling is that through our lives and our testimony, it is how we reach others, how we share the hope or the teachings of the good news. How I had mentioned before, when we say we have faith, we also have to accompany it with our actions, with our good fruits, with our good testimony. We cannot say that we are believers. We cannot say that we believe in the Messiah. We cannot say that we believe in the celestial promises that Yeshua came to bring closer to humanity. We cannot say that we believe that there's a creator, that we believe that it is important for all souls to return to the Father, that we have a faith. We cannot be saying all those stuff if our fruits or if our testimony says other words. So in all of this example of not only the disciples or the apostles, but also of Yeshua himself, we can take them as those good testimonies that in this case the disciples, although yes, they did lack in faith in certain situations, however, they corrected their path, they corrected their living, and decided to not only fully understand everything that was happening, but they also accepted it, and therefore they started to live that their lives. They started to pilgrim in obedience and in consecration, with their focus in fulfilling their calling, in fulfilling their calling. So in that way, they can also live striving every single day to be able to receive those celestial promises that Yeshua brought towards the souls. So this is what we can see, or that we can read in this last chapter of Mark, chapter 16. We read this resurrection of Yeshua, how this resurrection was important for it to happen, because not only does it fulfill a prophecy, but also it demonstrates that Yeshua was the Messiah that had been waited for, and that the importance of not acting like the crowd, which they acted in, or the multitude, which they acted in ignorance, they acted in blindness, rather act like the disciples. That yes, they did have some errors, but they corrected them, and they lived a a life in obedience and in consecration. And also, another lesson that we can receive from this chapter 16 is taking the example of these two women, of these two Marys, who them, instead of being carried away by their emotions that they were feeling at that time, of being scared, of being scared of what they were witnessing, rather what they did is they believed, they accepted this resurrection, and they shared this message of the good news of the resurrection of Yeshua towards the disciples. And this is what we can see, or what we can study in this chapter 16, this very short chapter 16 of Mark. And to conclude with today's video and also gospel or good news, we have been reading throughout this whole good news of Mark, or we can notice that Mark emphasizes more about Yeshua's actions rather than his teachings. Like if it was in the case of Matthew, that in Matthew it focuses more about Yeshua's teachings. We read that, or we have been reading throughout all of these studies of Mark, that the author of Mark jumps straight to Yeshua's mission. He starts off narrating about Yeshua's baptism, which was done by John the Baptist, where it is announced about the kingdom that was coming closer, or that had been brought through Yeshua the Messiah. As well, in this event of Yeshua's baptism, we also read that it revealed how Yeshua is the one sent and anointed by the Creator Almighty. From there, we read about the beginning of Yeshua's public ministry, starting off in Galilee all the way to Judea. And we also read about this calling of the disciples, the miracles Yeshua did, the healings he did, the liberation of demons that he did. In this case, as we read in this chapter 16, Yeshua liberated all of these demons out of Mary Magdalene, which we studied in this Gospel of Mark as well. We can read all about these liberations that Yeshua did, the parables that Yeshua gave, the teachings that he did, or even the feedings that Yeshua did towards these big number of multitudes that were there, hearing to what Yeshua had to say. Or even throughout this whole Gospel of Mark, we have also been reading exhortations that Yeshua gives not only to his disciples, but also to the multitude that was there listening to his words. The main message that we can receive from this Gospel of Mark, and that we have learned throughout this Gospel of Mark, is about the kingdom that Yeshua has brought closer for the souls who truly commit to returning to the Father, or to the Creator, and thus live a life in obedience and consecration. These promises, and this promise of the great redemption that Yeshua brings closer to humanity, is something that Mark that clarifies within this book, is that these promises and this redemption is only brought, or can only be brought, can only be achieved. There we go. It can only be achieved through Yeshua and not no one else. There is no religion, there is no priests, there is no leader, there is no religion, there is nothing that we can use so that we can receive these celestial promises and this redemption and the salvation of our soul. Only through Yeshua. So this is something very important that we understand, that we studied in this Gospel of Mark. We also learned in this Gospel of Mark about the importance of putting to death our disbelief, our selfishness, our arrogance, our religious traditions, our human perspectives, our physiological perspectives, many different type of perspectives that are taught in the world that we must leave. Taking the example of the religious of the disciples, who we read in their calling, how they used to be like any other person, religious, liberal, etc. But once they were called by Yeshua, once they understood the whole prophecies that were being fulfilled, once they accepted and fulfilled and started to fulfill with their calling, with their calling, they corrected their way of living. They put to death all type of selfishness. They put to death what satisfies their flesh, and they started living in that obedience and that consecration, in that focus towards the celestial promises, towards fulfilling their calling. So taking this testimony of the disciples, we must apply it to our lives if we call ourselves believers. This is a very important lesson that we learned throughout this whole Gospel of Mark, the importance of putting to death what satisfies our flesh, following the example of the disciples. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time. We will see each other in the next video.